Thank you for joining us this afternoon. In the Honors Residential College, it's a proud tradition of ours to gather for intellectual conversation and to explore the life of the mind as it relates to Christian faith. I was talking to an HRC student this afternoon, and I often marvel at how much students grow in this community. And part of growing means exposing and opening oneself up to the realities of the world around us. Today, in making the Drumwright family lecture, a lecture and a panel about poverty at front lines, that's what we're doing. So we're grateful for you all being here. We're especially grateful for the Drumwright family to be with us this afternoon. I want to welcome up Dean Tom Hibbs, who's going to introduce the panel and moderate the experience for us. Thank you, Dean Hibbs.
Thank you, Jonathan, and we're delighted to have all of you with us today for another really terrific Drumwright family lecture event, although we may have to alter that title because we've moved from last year and this from lecture mode to panel discussion mode, and so we hope to keep that going. As I was saying to some people earlier, each one of our panelists today, and I'm just going to say a little bit about them to introduce them, could be a Drumwright lecturer in his or her own right. So we're delighted to have three terrific panelists, and I'll say more about them in a moment. I want to remind those of you who've been with us before and inform those of you who haven't just how honored we are to have Minette Drumwright Pratt with us today. She and her family initiated this lecture in honor of the Drumwright family. The first Drumwright relative to attend Baylor was L.L. Johnson, who graduated from Baylor in 1909. Minette's great-grandson, Jackson, who was born in May 2016, is on course to be the sixth generation of the Drumwright family to attend Baylor as a member of the class of 2038. That's a lot of years for those of you who can do math. That's a lot of years that the Drumwright family has been connected to Baylor University. And Minette, who is here with us, has been connected to Baylor in lots of ways. She went to Baylor, she served on the Board of Regents. She has served, more importantly than the Baylor Board of Regents, is that she served on the Baylor Honors College Advisory Council and still does. She's been a member of that advisory council for us since our inception as an honors college, and she's been a supporter of what we've done here in the Honors College and an enthusiastic supporter. Her family has fully endowed this lecture, so the Drumwright Family Lecture will exist in the Honors College in perpetuity for all the ages to come, as the Baylor founding says. So we are delighted that she is with us and that she continues to support us, and she's become such a dear friend to all of us, and her family have become dear friends. So please, let's give Minette a hand. I do have to warn our participants in the panel that being involved in this lecture can be dangerous. You could end up, this may be especially worrisome for Heather for a reason I'll mention in a moment, but you could end up at Baylor if you participate in this lecture. David Solomon, who went to Baylor, was the inaugural lecturer and then had a visiting appointment here. Alan Jacobs was the lecturer a few years later, and then we hired him. Robbie George was here last year, and he now has a research appointment in ISR and is doing some work with us here on campus and in Washington, D.C. Jeremy, in the middle, is already a member of the Baylor family, but Robert and Heather, watch out. I say this may be especially concerning to Heather because she's a proud graduate of TCU. So, and despite that, she's risen really high. Sorry, Heather. Let me just say a few words about about each of our participants, and then I'm going to ask them a question, and we have a few questions planned. We may not get through all of them. I want to give them some time for give and take, and they're not, none of the three is shy about his or her opinions, and they both are doing really interesting, innovative work on the problem of poverty in America today. And then we will, toward the end, leave time for some questions from you. I think Dr. Tran will run a microphone around so we can make sure that everybody can hear that question. Let me begin on the end with Robert Doar, we're delighted to have back to Baylor. He's a resident fellow and Morgridge Fellow of Poverty Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. And at AEI, while he's been at AEI, he served as the co-chair of the National Commission on Hunger and as a board member of the AEI Working Group on Poverty and Opportunity. That commission was also, another member of that commission was Jeremy Everett. Before joining AEI, Mr. Doar worked for Mayor Michael Bloomberg's as Commissioner of New York City's Human Resources Administration. You can see in the notes about each of them the details of all the work he did in New York, overseeing a vast array of human resource activities and projects and initiatives. He has a bachelor's degree in history from Princeton University. Robert, we're really glad to have you with us. Heather Reynolds is President and CEO of Catholic Charities Fort Worth, overseeing the strategic direction of the Fort Worth-based $30 million nonprofit. She's known for her innovation in this work, which is being modeled across the country in Catholic Charities offices. Just to mention a couple things, during the 2014 border crisis, she doubled the amount of beds that Catholic Charities Fort Worth shelter had available, meeting the needs of over 200 vulnerable children. And because of this work, CCFW received local and national recognition, very deserved recognition. She's also the national advisor for the United States Catholic Bishops Committee on Migration, and is a proud alum of TCU, and we're delighted to have her in Waco, the center of Texas. And last but certainly not least, our own Jeremy Everett is the founder and executive director of the Texas Hunger Initiative, a great, remarkable initiative, capacity building, anti-hunger project within Baylor University, which partners with the Department of Agriculture, Texas State Agency, and numerous faith and community-based organizations to develop and implement strategies to alleviate hunger. He was also served on that U.S. commission that I mentioned earlier, and we're delighted to have him here with us. One last comment about this, which is that I want to thank Jonathan and Courtney and Paulette and Grant Jones for their help in planning this event. The folks we have here really came together because of the work that some of us do for Baylor in Washington, D.C. Robert is stationed there in D.C. Heather, I actually met at an AEI event last December where she was speaking on poverty, and Jeremy is up there more than perhaps any other Baylor person, which means he lives on American Airlines. But it's one of these things where we take Baylor to D.C. and then we bring D.C. back to Baylor, and we're delighted to have the three of them with us. Please welcome our three panelists. I want to ask each of you to begin, and we'll start with Heather and work our way down, by responding. And I know you could speak at length on this, so we'd like you to hit some highlights so we can get to a number of issues. But tell us why you do what you do. What is the most important thing that everyone in the audience here needs to know about the kind of work you do, researching, collaborating, attempting to practically alleviate poverty in America? Why do you do this? How did you come to do it? What do we need to know about that? Heather, please.
Great, I'd be happy to share. Well, thank you first of all for having me. So grateful to be in Bear Country. I got into this work really because of my faith and my upbringing. I did not grow up in poverty, but my family always made sure I came face to face with poverty through volunteer work, and that, my faith, led me to choose this line of work. But to be honest with you, my whole call and purpose in life to really eliminating poverty became a lot more serious to me about 5 years ago when my husband and I became parents. And we became parents through adoption, and our adoption journey took us around the world to Taichung, Taiwan, where we adopted our little girl. And without a doubt, best day of my life was the day we adopted our daughter. But right after we met our little girl, we had the opportunity to sit down with her birth mother. And her birth mother was, at the time, a 16-year-old girl who had made an adoption plan, had chosen life, and had picked my husband and I to be her parents. And there was a 10-month wait between when she did this and we got to go over to Taiwan to get our daughter. And it was amazing because she had been studying English in the time it took for us to get there. And she'd been studying English because she told us, and she wanted to be able to tell us in her own words what her hopes and dreams were for her little girl. And they were the sweetest things, that she would learn to read, that she would be loved, and that she would be who God intended her to be. And I remember sitting there just shaking as I was recognizing at that moment that this 16-year-old girl and her extended family, they really wanted to parent my daughter, but what really stood between their ability to do that was poverty. And while I am forever grateful that this, my little Olive is my daughter, and that this birth mom chose life, you know, I will never quit fighting to end poverty as long as I have a breath in me, because I'm a firm believer that poverty should not stand in between a mom's dreams for her child and her ability to make those things happen. So for me, it just got ever more personal about 5 years ago, which has made me even more convicted that we've got to figure out a solution to ending poverty, at least here in this country.
Thank you. That was very powerful. For me, it was an issue of calling, and I was in college in Birmingham, Alabama, at a small school, Samford University, which is very similar to Baylor, but a little bit smaller. And when I got to college, I had the question of the inequity of wealth that was on my mind. I'm not really sure how it got there, but it was on my mind. It was a question I took to my courses when I would visit with my faculty, professors and faculty members on campus. When I would go to visit with my pastor, that was a question that I brought with me. And so I really dealt with that question for about 3 years. It's interesting, you know, here I am, I'm the one Baptist on a panel of Catholics, and I'm a third generation Baptist preacher's kid. Thought I would go become another Baptist preacher, because that was the family business. And but it was actually the story of St. Francis of Assisi while I was at that Baptist university that changed my life. And I was a youth minister one summer after my junior year of college, and I was sitting in my dorm room, and I remember we'd just been on a big youth trip. I was exhausted, and I turned on the TV, and the story of Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, which is a story of St. Francis, was on. And it was talking about this young man named Francesco, and Francesco gave away all his possessions to live a life intertwined with people in poverty and to rebuild the church of San Diamano. And I knew in that moment that was what I needed to do. And so I remember gathering all of my stuff in my room, my little dorm room, and loading it up into my car and driving over the mountain in Birmingham to Kelly Ingram Park, which is where a lot of the civil rights activity happened in the 60s and where a lot of homeless people hang out today. And I remember giving away all my possessions in that little park, and at that moment I knew I was called to the issue of poverty. I had no idea what that meant, and I still don't think I do. But then a second encounter was with another Catholic theologian, a guy named Gustavo Gutierrez, and Father Gutierrez came to campus when I was here in graduate school, and I was able to get to meet him. And by this point, I had been living in an inner city neighborhood for about 5 years, and I sat down with Father Gutierrez, and I asked him, I said, "How do you have solidarity with the poor?" And he said, "Commit your life to their cause." And I think those two experiences for me were very fundamental in understanding calling for me. So,
Thank you, Robert.
So Tom, first I want to say, I come from not the community-based or not-for-profit or faith-based world. I worked in government before I went to AI, and since coming there, I've gotten to know Heather and Jeremy. And I want you to know that Texas is really lucky to have these two outstanding people doing work for people in need. Government doesn't solve every problem. We are so dependent on the work of programs like theirs. And I just want to tell you how proud and honored that I am that I'm among them and with them. And this is not the first time, and we've been together on a lot of things, and I'm glad we've got more to do going forward together. For me, I was very lucky. I grew up in a household where my dad, who was a small town lawyer in northwest Wisconsin, went to work in Washington at the very end of the Eisenhower administration as a Republican, and he joined the Civil Rights Division of the United States Justice Department. And he went to work then on issues concerning voting and school desegregation and changing our country for the better when it came to the rules concerning civil rights and voting rights for African Americans. And he had really a remarkable career. The Kennedys kept him, and he stayed under President Johnson, and he was the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. And he made a lot of great progress in that regard. And then Robert Kennedy asked him to start an anti-poverty program in Bedford-Stuyvesant, which is a large urban area about the size of the city of Pittsburgh that was very poor and very struggling. And I grew up in that environment, watching him after this, I think, notable success along with Dr. King and many others in civil rights, not really making much progress in anti-poverty efforts in Brooklyn in the 70s and 80s. And as I saw that and witnessed that and saw the frustration, I decided that when I came of age and had an opportunity to get involved in politics and government, that the field I wanted to work in was ways to help people move into work, move up in opportunity, escape poverty through employment, through stronger families, through better schools. And so that's what led me to become active politically and to work for a candidate for governor. And then when he won, I was ready to go. I said, I'll first in line to serve in whatever capacity I can in your administration. And I was lucky again then because one of the funny things about Republicans is when they're in power, the line for jobs in social services is really short. So I had an opportunity to get a lot of responsibility quickly, and that's what I did for the next 20 years. And we made some progress, but we've still got a ways to go. But that's how I got into it.
Thank you. So this is a question that shifts gears a bit, but each of you is engaged in trying to think anew. I mean, I know this about all three of you when I've talked to you. You're always trying to see what are the new things that can be done, the new collaborations, the new initiatives. I think we'd all like to hear from each of you to tell us a little about one or two really exciting innovations in the fight against poverty, things that you think have some traction and are or could make a big difference. Heather?
One of the things we've done as an organization for the last several years is we've formed partnerships with academic institutions, specifically economists, to study our work. Because, you know, I'm not in the business of repeat customers. I'm in the business of ending poverty. And so we as an organization want to know what works and what doesn't work. And so one example is we're really concerned, our community is, about the low graduation rates among community colleges throughout our country. People often don't know this, but less than 20% of students who start community college ever graduate or transfer to a four-year university. But we know community college is often the option for low income, and we know that that often can be the difference between a lifetime of minimum wage employment to a lifetime of minimum wage to living wage employment. So we run a randomized controlled trial where basically we embed Catholic Charities Fort Worth case managers in the context of the community college system. What happens with that is at the start of every semester, the community college sends a list to the University of Notre Dame. They randomize those students into a treatment group or a control group. We get the list of those in the treatment group. We're told, go find those folks and serve them. And we do by providing that intensive case management. And intensive case management to us is really our theory of change. We believe that that intervention is most critical because it helps families, or in this case students, alleviate barriers they might have. They're about to be evicted, they don't have transportation, they need childcare. And at the same time, it also helps coach them with issues, mindset issues, belief in oneself. You know, I grew up in a world where if I failed a test, you know, my parents might, you know, kind of push me a little bit, but I didn't think I was done with college. You know, the students we see, that's what they think. And so that case management in the community college system has been our core intervention. And what we have seen, which has been amazing, is that the control group and the treatment group versus the control group is having tremendous success. The treatment group students are 2.5 times more likely to persist in their education and to graduate. We're seeing a more profound effect even with females in the treatment group, 4 times more likely over the control group to persist in their education and graduate, which for us is really exciting because we know the more students we can get persisting and completing, the more likely we are to get them into living wage employment. Here in Texas, the average earnings of someone who has an associate's degree versus just a GED or high school diploma is about $11,000 more a year. And so we know that this is a meaningful intervention, and so our next goal is really about how do we scale this up.
Great. Thank you. Jeremy?
Well, first of all, I want to comment on, so Heather's work, one of the reasons that we gravitated towards it, many of you have probably seen the commercial, the Fidelity Investments commercial where they have the blue line, you know, on the sidewalk, and and so somebody who's contemplating retirement and wants to know how to retire, they sit down with their investment advisor, and their advisor guides them through the process towards having a healthy retirement. Well, oftentimes what we don't think about is you know, the complexity of poverty. Poverty is incredibly complex, and so navigating poverty and trying to work with as a family to get on the other side of poverty is insurmountable in many cases. It's not just about having a good paying job, but a good paying job is that's where you want to get people to. And what I love about Heather's model is they're almost like these Fidelity investment commercials. She and her team of case managers are taking each individual and each family that they're working with, and they're helping them develop that blue line so that they are being guided through the process of poverty to financial independence. And you know, and these are trained experts who know the system. And who are guiding people through the process. So I'm very impressed with that. And one of the things that we love about Robert is Robert's gonna tell you the truth as he sees it, and it doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat, you're gonna have to deal with it. And one of the greatest values he brings to Washington is he really is a prophetic voice, and that he's asking very deep, very hard questions on a consistent basis that our elected officials and appointed officials are having to deal with. He's very well respected in Washington, and so people have to contend with that. Now, on my answer on what I think is innovative, y'all know me, I get preachy. For me, as I mentioned, poverty is too complex for any one organization, any one individual, or any one agency to be able to address on its own. It's just too complicated. The only way that we're going to be able to effectively reduce hunger and poverty, both domestically or globally, is if we're all working together. And so for us, what's really of critical importance is building a cross-sector collaborative approach to getting organizations working together collaboratively to identify needs, develop strategic plans around those needs, and then addressing those needs comprehensively. A community I like to brag on is this community in San Angelo, which is West Texas. They identified as a community that they had 10,000 children that were on their free and reduced lunch program in 2009. And they had a couple of plant closures during that time period, but they saw that they only served 1,000 meals to children over the course of that following summer. So they knew they had a lot of children going hungry. And so they worked with our team, and they organized a coalition, a collaborative effort, and it had the city, it had their congressman, at the table. It had the local congregations were there, the city council was there, the school district, the nonprofits. Everybody showed up to work together on this particular issue. Churches said, well, hey, we've got commercial kitchens. We can make meals in our commercial kitchen. Businesses said, well, we'll provide the volunteer support to pick up the meals and deliver them to summer meal sites. And nonprofits and congregations in low-income neighborhoods said, well, we'll be summer meal sites so you can serve the food to the children in our building. And in just a few months worth of planning, by working together, they served 20,000 meals to kids that next summer. We've used that model, and now we've done over 500 million more meals to children over the past several years in the state of Texas. Just not by inventing new programs, just simply by getting people to work together. And so to me, that's one of the steps that we're going to be required to take if we effectively hope to end poverty in our time.
Thank you.
So I think that in the last, since 1990 or so, we've made some progress in helping struggling Americans. But the most thing that we've done that's really shown progress is we've relieved the material hardship. We've been able to provide transfer payments, food stamp benefits, public health insurance, earned income tax credits that have made the material well-being of Americans stronger than it used to be, even at the bottom. But what we haven't done, though, is help them earn their own success so that they can work and earn a living and not have the transfer payments be the key difference between being in poverty and not being in poverty. So my view is that we need to do a better job of making sure that the programs that are designed to help people by relieving their material difficulties also focus on employment and help them move into employment as rapidly as possible. Now, there's one little issue with that, and that is that you may get them into work, but it might be relatively low-wage work. It might be low-wage work. And here's where maybe I'm a little different than the others. I want to walk before I can run. And sometimes you have to get people to the first ladder, rung on the ladder, and the second ladder before you can really focus on further up. And so I feel that we've gotten a little difficulty in the country in the last 10 years where we've been more focused on just relieving people's difficulties with assistance and not focused enough on employment. And we have a number of Americans who are outside the labor market, that are not looking for work, that are able-bodied, they're not disabled. And part of the reason for that is that we've been able to support them with various forms of assistance that act as a disincentive to that first rung of work in the labor market. And so I think that is what our big programs need to do. Now, that doesn't mean this transformative work and education work and ever work to bring people up beyond that shouldn't still go on. But we can't, what has worked in the past, what worked when I was in New York City, New York State, was getting people into work and then supporting work with various forms of assistance that make those wages go further, and then helping them move up from there. But once we provide assistance that allows them to stay out of employment, I think we really are not helping them in the long run. We're hurting them and their families. And just one other thing I do need to say, because it in the area of poverty, especially child poverty, needs to get mentioned fairly upfront, and that is we need to work on stronger families. Children just do better in two-parent families where both parents are active and involved, and in the United States that most often happens within marriage. And so all of our institutions, are not just our politicians, and not only our politicians, but our faith-based organizations, our community-based organizations, need to be willing to talk to young people about the benefits for their children if they form healthy, long-lasting relationships with the person they're going to have that child with. Because that healthy, long-lasting relationship may be the biggest and most important ingredient in ensuring that their child does not grow into poverty. So those are two things I think we could talk more about and work harder on.
Great. I know Heather just gestured she wants to respond, and I'm pretty confident Jeremy does too. So because you laid a lot out there, so that's great.
Yeah, I want to emphasize a little bit about what Robert's talking about with work, because we as an organization are a work-first model. We want to get people into, we know things change in families' lives when they start behaving and actively behaving in certain ways. It doesn't matter the amount they start saving day one when they're with us. It could be $1 a week, but that behavior matters. We believe the same thing with work. There's two big things, though, we struggle with, and we see low-income families struggle with. The first is what we refer to often in our industry as the benefit cliff. So we have this unfortunate situation where we often find ourselves working against the federal government, because what happens often for the families we're serving is they're on public assistance programs. We get them a job, they begin working, and then they end up losing public assistance benefits because they don't qualify for them. But they are working now, but they're making less than they were on public assistance programs. So one of the things we've really been advocating for is, rather than this sharp cutoff of benefits, and food stamps in Texas is an example of a more generous, gradual decline, but rather than this sharp cutoff once you start earning that can disincentivize people to work, having a smaller, more gradual benefit cliff, so work always pays and moves people forward till they get to the point of living wage and self-sufficiency. The other big point to recognize is often what we find with families who are trying to get into the workforce is just such a struggle managing the dynamics of their life. They're complicated. Quick story, we recently had a client named Perla. We've been working with her for the past 2 years. Perla is married, came to us, had at the time a 1-year-old little boy, and when Perla walked through our door, she was about to be evicted, and what she asked for is for us to pay a bill. And we always try to upsell everyone and say, okay, well, we know you came for a bill, but how about a long-term journey out of poverty with us? And we have some success with that. And Perla was one of the clients who said, okay, yeah, what you got here? Let's see. And so we assigned her a case manager to really do life with her. Well, our first step was to get Perla a job. Perla's husband was working, going to school, but his job was a minimum wage job. We needed another minimum wage job worker in the household until Dad got his vocation education. They could earn more to living wage. And so Perla needed to get to work. Perla's case manager gets her a job, she quits it within a week. Perla's case manager gets her another job, she quits it within 2 weeks. Well, most people, let's be honest, would just assume Perla really doesn't want to work. Perla might just be a little lazy. Well, a case manager, and this is the power of it, sat down with Perla and said, I need to understand what's going on. Are you serious about this? What's happening? And Perla broke into tears and talked about the fact that every day when she left for work, she was taking her son to a child care situation, and she was terrified when she drove off and left him in that situation. And for any of you who are mamas or have a child in your life you care about, I'm a mama. I cannot imagine leaving my daughter somewhere where I questioned if they would be safe. And so Perla would work a few days and quit because she just couldn't handle it. So like good case management can do, we said to Perla, okay, Perla, here's our deal. We will get you a third job. Your commitment will be to find a good middle-class daycare center that you feel comfortable leaving your child, that you can't afford day one, but after you get a few paychecks under your belt that you can afford. So Perla agreed to this. We said, Perla, we'll pay months 1 and 3 of your child care costs. You pay months 2 and 4. And at the end of 6 months, if you still have that same job, we'll reimburse you for months 2 and 4. It's been 2 years. Perla still has that same job. Perla next week, with the paycheck she'll be receiving, will hit our definition of out of poverty at Catholic Charities, which means her family will be earning a living wage. They'll have 3 months of savings, no debt, and off of government assistance. She just needs a little more for her savings account, which will come next week, which will get her there. But that's the example of, we need to get people into the workforce, but we also need somebody understanding why they're not and what we can do to eliminate and resolve those barriers.
Great. Jimmy?
That's great. Now you know why we love her program. And I think one of the things that we see, I don't understand why public assistance programs and work have always been pitted against each other. We used to talk about this. We were on the commission together. They have to be hand in hand. And ultimately, we all want people to be gainfully employed. But for whatever reason, those have all become such political talking points that one side won't agree to what the other side is suggesting, even when it's commonsensical, as Robert mentioned. I think, one of the things that we do see often for families that are in poverty is they're experiencing trade-offs because they don't make very much money. Because if you're getting full-time wages in Texas and making minimum wage, you're making about a little over $12,000 a year. So not a lot of money. You can imagine if you have children. To Robert's point, if you're a single income earner and you have a couple of kids, there's no possible way that you're going to be able to pay rent, buy food. If you need medication or clothing or anything, forget about it. So what often happens for families in poverty is they do what are called trade-offs. So they're determining each month what they're going to pay for. Now, since we work in the hunger space, we know that oftentimes what they choose not to pay for is food, because if you don't pay for food, you're not going to get evicted. Your car's not going to get repossessed, and so that's one of the trade-offs that typically happen. But we also know medication is a big trade-off. So you just have all these trade-offs that people are having to choose what are they going to pay for each given month. We know that we visited personally with many parents who've sat down and just wept with us, knowing that they don't get to eat at the end of the month because they're making sure that their kids have something to eat. And so I think what Heather's pointing out is, man, we can do better than this. But if we're going to do better than this, it's going to have to be us really looking at the facts and working across all these sectoral lines that have been developed over the course of time.
The one thing that I think you should notice here is that there's a distinction in the two roles that the government agency plays and the agencies like Heather and Jeremy's play. We're big in government programs. We treat people, we focus on transactions. We're good at giving you money and not really doing much more than that, providing assistance. But if you want to get to the kind of issues that Heather described and that kind of interaction, that takes place best in an environment like Heather's, in my opinion, in my experience, where there's a real commitment to human capital development, there's a moral and faith-based motivation behind it. And what I need to say in the dynamic of that is that if government makes it, and this is going to sound controversial and harsh, but if they make it so that people don't have to turn to the institutions of civil society, like Heather and Jeremy's, when they're in need, they won't. And when they don't, they won't get the benefit of that working together and that interaction that government can never provide just with a transfer payment. So what that means sometimes is that, these big, inhuman federal welfare programs sometimes have to say, if you're not willing to seek employment or go to a community-based organization and do 10 hours of volunteer work, or do something that exhibits a little bit of agency and a little bit of recognition that it's a reciprocal relationship between the government and the citizen in the providing of assistance, then we may have to terminate your benefits. And in doing that, what I believe happens is they both comply and they turn to the institutions of civil society that can help them better than government can. And so you need to be aware that there's a harshness to a little bit of what I'm saying about focusing on employment and never saying to someone, you aren't part of this too. We need something from you as well as we're going to provide assistance.
Response to that? Last point? I mean, one of the questions that this raises, all three of you are between the kind of two extremes that show up sometimes in American public discourse, a kind of libertarian, let them pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, or government programs are going to do all the work, and anybody who works on problems like this is typically somewhere in.
We basically agree, but I'm trying hard to make us not agree.
No, but that's what I wanted to go to next, is that the differences, therefore, are actually more interesting between the three of you. And
And so the question I want to ask is, Robert, you've laid out some kind of relative balance between government initiatives and private initiatives and personal responsibility. How would Jeremy, and why don't you start, Jeremy, and then Heather, how would you see that kind of balance between public-private, government, faith-based, and other private organizations and personal responsibility?
Well, like I told Robert a lot when we were serving on the commission together, you're almost right. Let me help you get across it. No, I think we've been a football school before, and everybody doesn't need to be a quarterback.
He has a
right?
big home field advantage.
That's
I just
right.
would like to
That
say.
is true. That is true. But everybody on the team can't play quarterback, right? And so you need a good offensive line, you need a good defensive line, you need good receivers, and so on and so forth. And I think the way I see a systemic approach to addressing the issue of poverty is that you need different organizations, different agencies, different individuals to play different roles. And if we're all, part of what we believe as Christians is we're created in the image of God. We believe, as Paul wrote, that everybody needs to be a part. Everybody plays a role in the body, right? And so if you kind of take that in a more macro sense, we all don't have to do the same thing. And so when government agencies are doing the best that they can to make sure that their benefits are administered in an efficient and an effective manner, and then they are working in concert with community-based organizations like Heather's, who are walking people through the process to ultimately get out of poverty, but utilizing some of these government benefits in that interim period until they are able to be completely out of poverty. That, to me, is when you're building a good system. We just have some gaps. We have some holes in our system right now where it's incomplete. And then what ends up happening is each sector has a tendency to think too highly of itself.
So give an example of
Okay,
one or
good
more
example.
of those gaps.
So I'll tell you. So what we did, one of the projects that we did with the state of Texas for about 4 or 5 years, is we built a community partner program for the state. And what the state, we worked with them to develop an online integrated application, because everybody applying for SNAP, or what used to be called food stamps, or Medicaid, or Medicare, or CHIP, everybody was having to sit down and fill out a paper application that might be a 20 to 40 page paper application. They would submit that application to somebody who would then input it into a computer at a state agency office. Then that would go to another agency office, and then they would have to download it and then put it into a different profile, and you name it. And so if one person was applying for 5 different applications, somebody had to review all that. And it was a bunch of somebody. So it was a very expensive way of doing it. So by building an online integrated application, that reduced the amount of hands and people that needed to deal with that particular process. Then we worked with the state to recruit and train 1,400 community-based organizations to be the direct access points for these programs. The benefit to that is organizations like Catholic Charities, is that a nonprofit organization at a local community level exists largely to deal with they care about the person in a holistic sense. So they're not just there to process an application. They're there to develop a relationship with the individual and to work with that individual until they're able to get out of poverty, much like Heather has described. So they care about the whole person. Well, a state agency office, it's a transactional relationship. It's just about you filling out, oftentimes, it's just about you filling out an application, you turn it in, they give it back to you, so on and so forth. Well, this program saved the state $500 million over a 5-year period in reduced bureaucratic spending, while increasing access to programs like SNAP and Medicaid and Medicare to the highest level in Texas's state history. So it was a very efficient, a very effective program. And one of the things that some of our researchers who are here identified is that when individuals that are experiencing food insecurity or episodic hunger, if they have a strong social network, like if they belong to one of these organizations or a congregation has become their entry point, and they develop relationships there. If they have a strong social network, they are less likely to be food insecure, even if they live below the poverty line, because now they have a group of people that are caring for them and helping connect them to opportunities. And so that, to me, is when you build a good system. Now, in typical government format, we do that for 4 years, and then we try something different, and we forget what worked. And so I think that'll be a part of the evolution of where we have to go.
Heather, and then Robert.
Yeah, I would say a couple of things on this topic. Even though I do agree that the government is more transactional and the nonprofit sector should be more transformational, I will say, being in this industry, I have been so frustrated over the years. And the reason I have been so frustrated is what I have seen is, as nonprofit, faith-based social service providers have really made the funder of their services in large part from government. What you start seeing in these multi-service organizations, and what we even had at Catholic Charities Fort Worth that we had to break up, is siloed programs for the poor that often look no different than what the government, just looks like an extension of the government. And so the social service agencies, where people should be forging relationships with clients that extend beyond, that are long-term and truly transformational, often have gotten reduced to, here's some assistance, and why are you back 30 days later? We're scratching our heads, but that really, we're not offering people something transformational. And I think that's a real problem with our industry. I mean, you just look at the Catholic Charities network across the nation. The average Catholic Charities funding, 70% of it is from government. And again, there's healthy partnership with government, but
What is yours?
30%. And there's healthy partnership, but then there's unhealthy partnership as well, which kind of makes the model be more governmental in nature, which is not what we think it should be. The other thing is, I will tell you, I think a big error in our industry is that people don't understand what works. We all anecdotally assume what works, but we don't know. You take the community college completion program I told you about. We got year one results. What we found is we had a treatment group who was getting case management, and we had a second treatment group who was just getting financial assistance from us, and then the control group. And what we saw at the end of year one is the group that was doing the best was those getting case management, then the control group, and the group who was doing the worst were the folks who were getting financial assistance. And most of us would assume all day long, well, just giving a client some money would be helpful. But in this particular intervention, it wasn't helpful. But we tested, so we knew that and we understood that, so we could eliminate that aspect of our work and double down on what was actually working.
So you asked where the holes are. I think that Heather pointed it out. In my experience, the biggest hole is early learning and childcare. We don't do, especially for households that are on various forms of assistance and working and are struggling, a great job with kids prior to kindergarten. And I happen to think that we need to be targeted in our approach and not try to serve everybody, because there are some families that are really vulnerable. But in my experience, childcare is the weakest link in the safety net. And I agree with Jeremy, getting us all to work more efficiently and effectively to get the applications in a uniform way and get them in does make the government more efficient and more effective at delivering benefits. It doesn't make it any better at helping someone get a job. And I think Jeremy doesn't disagree with me on that. And I think the great thing about what Jeremy also said was that he's way into partnerships and roles and understanding that we need a variety of approaches from a variety of different institutions that have different sweet spots in their work, and I think that is the answer.
Great. Let's take a few questions. Thank you all. That was terrific. Questions, please.
You mentioned, okay. Hi, I'm Kara. I'm a university scholar here at Baylor. You all mentioned instances when the government hindered someone's climb out of poverty. Can you mention any specific programs or how we can fix those programs to make it more effective?
Yes, I'd be happy to. I would say one of the most effective things we could do as a country is collapse benefits. So instead of it being where you have, here's food stamps and here's, kind of what Jeremy talked about with the integrated health, but broader, with childcare dollars, with transportation, it'd be so great if those were collapsed, and then we could understand what a family needed and used it accordingly. So that would be one thing, and then the other thing would be is benefits incrementally dropping off rather than the sharp drop-offs that currently happen in today's system.
Yeah, and I want to be clear. I am pro-government support for families in poverty, very much so. I'm a huge believer that is our collective responsibility. That puts flesh on loving our neighbor, and I think that's not only something that we're supposed to do as a Christian household. Every faith tradition talks about that, and so I'm a big believer that the government has a strong role in that. In fact, only 3% of the needed food for people that are experiencing food insecurity in the state of Texas comes from charitable sources. Only 3%. The other 50% of it comes from their own personal resources, from their own jobs, and then the other comes from government. A lot of the work that Buddy Edwards, who's here, who runs Charities, is having to do all the time. I mean, it's Charities is a public and private partnership. You go in their warehouse, and he can show you what is sourced from the government, what is sourced from local community groups, but it is a public and private partner. But I think government has to be an anchor partner in this. So, though, having said that, now the three of us live in public policy. And so just like anything that you work in all the time, there are always things that can be improved upon. And certainly our government programs give us plenty to talk about and want to improve upon. But by and large, I'm very much an advocate for those.
Yeah, and I would also agree with Jeremy that's what I meant by saying that a lot of what we've done has been successful at raising incomes and encouraging work and helping people move out of poverty. So I'm also a government guy. I just think that sometimes we can overdo it and not rely on local and community-based institutions. And I also think we have to promote personal responsibility in work. So, and I don't think we've done enough of that in that field. And so I think that's where we could focus on. But the things that work are things that take someone who works and gets an appropriate amount of assistance that makes those wages go further so they can afford what they need for their children and their family and their household. The Earned Income Tax Credit is a good program, provides assistance to working people. Food stamps is a good program when it's provided to disabled or seniors or kids or working people. I get a little nervous when it's going to non-workers, even in a good economy. Now, as to Heather's idea of putting it all to one, I think we need to be clear about this. This is very popular in the country. If you go to Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives, they love more flexibility and unified funding source so they can figure out how to make it work for their community. It is very unpopular in Washington, from both the right and the left. The left does not like it because they view it as a vehicle to cut spending and to walk away from the federal responsibility and just turn it over to the states. And the right doesn't like it because they're afraid it'll end up being a big block grant that gets an inflationary adjustment on it every year. And it doesn't matter how many struggling people you have in your state, every year you're going to get 3% more, and it's going to just drain the federal coffers and go out and no one knows what happens to it. So as a result, I'd hate to disappoint Heather in this, it's a hard thing. She's testified on a number of occasions on this importance. Speaker Ryan is a great believer and supporter of her idea, but it's just a really hard battle in Washington. And Jeremy and I saw it play out in the Hunger Commission, where just a little hint of it that I wanted to be in the report nearly caused the whole thing to come apart. Thankfully, Jeremy came to my rescue and said, it's okay, we can do that. And we got it through. But I just wanted to give you a little sense of our world. Sorry.
We spent, I don't know if y'all have had any group writing processes as students, but I tell you what, it's you should, especially if you want to go into public policy. We spent 2 years writing a report together. I think that took us about 8 to 10 weeks, and we were debating over one prepositional phrase. And as
you can see, it got a little frustrating for the Texan.
We almost scrapped the whole thing over one preposition. But man, we can parse sentences now. So learn how to do that.
Yeah, hi. I'm Mackenzie Chandler. I'm a resident here at the AHRC. And over the panel today, you sort of talked about economic poverty and how you're combating that. But there are more types of poverty I'm sure you're aware of. What are some things that you're doing to combat things like spiritual poverty or intellectual poverty? Just what are you doing to pull them out of those types of poverties as well?
Well, with intellectual poverty, we all talk to politicians every day, so we're doing the best we can. I don't know.
Amen.
And I'm related to a bunch of preachers, so I mean, as I'm doing. I think I'm carrying my weight in that regard. But
it's actually, you raise a very important and relatively new issue in the poverty discussions. The Gates Foundation has funded something called the Mobility from Poverty Initiative, and a lot of very smart people and activists and community-based leaders have participated in it. And they've identified a concept which I find a little hard to wrap my head around. The idea that people are not really out of poverty until they feel as if they're a full and valued participant in their community, that their views are important, their political efforts have a similar power that others have. And that's a hard one to accomplish, and it's particularly hard for someone who's spent all his time really focusing on economic issues. But it is an emerging issue, and it's important because it would be it'd be easier to fight economic poverty if we also had people in America universally feeling like they're all valued, that their contribution is always important, and that we're part of a really forward-moving, receptive, welcoming society. And we've had some hits on that of late, and we've got to work on that. On the last one, just on one thing, we haven't talked a lot about schools. We are not in the school space very much. AI and others are, and I do feel that a lot of positive things have happened in education coming from the charter school movement. I strongly recommend to all of you the new book that just came out, The Education of Eva Moskowitz, because Eva is a charter school operator in very poor communities in New York City. She's been at it for a long time, and she took the time to write down her reflection on her experience and chronicle what she was up against and what she's accomplished. And she's accomplished a lot, but it was hard, and I think we got to recognize that schools play a big role. It's work, schools, and family together make progress, but the issues about dignity are an even harder one, and we need voices that are welcoming and inclusive and positive about our American values, but also about our belief that we are a diverse and positive country.
It was interesting in one of our trials that we have going on. It's an asset-based model, and one of the assets that we have on there is Christ-filled faith, thinking if we improve on that asset, that sounds so weird to say it that way, but that it would help get families more quickly to our out-of-poverty definition. And in our year one results, it was the asset our case managers spent the least amount of time on. And so when I first saw that, I was like, what happened here? Was this an execution problem? And the reality was our clients scored so high when they came in of how at least they perceived their relationship with God and their church community in that. Now, that may not be the same across the nation, but at least that was true for the clients that we serve. What we do focus a lot on is hope at our organization. And in fact, we've got several studies going on, all geared toward, can we give hope boosts to the clients that we're serving that keep them engaged in services or have them engage with us at all beyond initial financial assistance? And we've done that through the form of, showing videos to clients when they first come in. And we've seen if we show a video to a client that looks like them, that says, I was sitting right where you were one day, today I'm in this place, stay the journey, go the long distance, blah, blah, that clients are about 70% of those clients are likely to say yes to a longer journey with us versus 30% who on average say yes otherwise. So we're trying to figure out all throughout the course of our time with a client, especially when we know those are the times where we're going to lose them, to have those boosts of hope so we can keep them engaged with us.
And I would just like to add to that. Part of that is communicating to Americans and people we're trying to help that there is opportunity, that we should and could be hopeful. And I do think sometimes, and I made a few references that may have indicated that I may have been talking about a certain president, but I also think at certain times others send a message that certain conditions in which you're born in the United States dictate that your outcome will be bad. And I don't think that's true, but I also think it's not helpful to the people we're trying to help. And I think we have to fight that too.
I think that's so important, because that's what I see in a big way, is there's all this research that people have been putting out lately from administrative data that's, if you grew up in the bottom 20%, the chances of you getting to the top 20% are, basically not going to happen. And it's frankly not helpful. What we need research on is how to make that happen, how to get upward mobility going on in our country. And I think that's what's been frustrating for those of us in this world.
Hi, my name is Chelsea. I'm in the Great Text program, and I'm a community leader here. So I've heard a lot about the different approaches to ending poverty, but it seems that there are two opposing forces. It seems like there's the kind of civil work and then also governmental work. So how do we foster more healthy conversation and cooperation between the government and then facilities who are working outside of the government?
Yeah, that's where I spend, I feel like, most of my life at this point. And a couple of ways. First of all, I want to say, I think, to the question on spiritual and intellectual poverty, I do think public education is the best anti-poverty program we have. I'm a big advocate and believer in that, even if it is struggling in many cases now. But on this, I want to speak to your question as well as the spiritual poverty question. So right now, we have, over the past, really the last decade, we've become entrenched in our political positions. And our political positions, honestly, probably bear more weight than our religious perspective and so forth. And so, in so doing, we've developed this idea that we think we are being prophetic. Many of us, as Christians, even think we are being prophetic witnesses by resisting the other individual that we disagree with, or ideally resisting the policy of the other individual that we disagree with. The problem with that is that it might begin with us resisting the policy, but ultimately we end up resisting the individual who is articulating that policy. And when we do that, we are committing an act of violence, because you, in that moment, we're not acknowledging that the other individual is created in the image of God. So when you resist the other individual, that is an act of violence. So I think that 21st century nonviolent action is in collaboration. It's in sitting down with somebody that is other than you and staying with them until you can find common ground. And that's what we're trying to facilitate with the nonprofit sector and the faith sector and the government sector and the corporate sector. It's slow. Much of our commission report was written in the last several months, even though we were together for 2 years, because it took a long time for us to get past our respective egos. It took a long time for us to get to a point where we could share pictures of our kids and grandkids and begin to form some relationships. And in so doing, that's when we recognized each other's common humanity. And that's when we got past ourselves and were able to actually have some real dialogue about about the recommendations that we should make. So I think that if we're going to move forward as a society, the only way it's going to happen is if we are sitting down with people that we probably initially despise, and we sit with them until we can find common ground. Otherwise, we're going to see more of what we're seeing in the news, and that's going to take us in the complete wrong direction, and we're certainly not going to move towards ending poverty.
On the sort of partnership between the government and community-based organizations, part of the problem that has occurred is a little bit of crowding out. The government has come in and civil society has shrunk. And that, I think, has led to us not having the right balance. And so in some respects, I feel, if you're asking specifically to the question, how do we make that partnership work better, I think two things have to happen. I think government needs to let go a little, and civil society has to step up. Now, I know I'm saying that in a place that's, drenched with civil society and people that are devoted to working in their churches and in their community-based organization, but that's special, and we need more of it in order to make, I think, more positive progress. So there is a balance in this government community-based issue, and I sometimes worry that and I'm from New York, where everything is solved by the state, the city, or the federal government, and that's a little exaggeration. But I was really impressed when I went to Houston in the wake of the hurricane, where in contrast to our response after Sandy, there was just a lot more citizen to citizen and church to family to neighbor going on than we had in New York. And we did a lot, and lots of people stepped up there too. And I raised this issue that we have to be careful about allowing government to be all purposeful. Heather?
Amen, amen. I have nothing else to add to that. That was too good, both of them.
Well, thank you. I was just sitting here thinking what a wonderful privilege it is to listen in to this conversation and for us to pose some questions for them to reflect on. And what Jeremy was saying about the kind of discourse we need, we saw that reflected here and at a very high level. It wasn't just a good give and take, respectful, but at a very high, very well-informed level. And that makes me think what a privilege it is for us to gather here at Baylor, to be in a university, to be in a Christian university where we're raising these questions seriously as a community, and where we learn about the complexity of the issue, but we're not simply leaving it there. We're learning from you how we might collaborate with you and how we might work in our own communities to actually help you to solve some of these problems. And I'm also thinking that what makes this particular annual event possible is Manette Drumwright Pratt and the wonderful conversations that we've had every year since you started this lecture series, and your family's support of it and of us. We want to say the final word of thanks to Manette and her family and to our three panelists. Thank you for coming.